Hi, how are you guys doing? So my name is Meng, I'm from Design Plus Code, and today we're going to be discussing about what is new about SwiftUI. Really excited to show you everything that I have been working on for the past couple of weeks, and feel free to ask questions while I'm doing this live stream. And also, I think it's really exciting where we are right now. You can see this is the app that I'm currently building, but also I'm preparing the course. So I'm reading the question and someone is asking, where is Mangto? I'm right here. Now, I'm going to go over what we're going to be discussing today, roughly. Of course, there's going to be a lot of details in between, but I'm going to start with some of the resources to get you started, such as the new developer forums by Apple, some of the Apple source codes that they have and that Apple is sharing. So that's really helping me learn SwiftUI. You know, it's new to everyone. It's like I'm not someone from Apple, so I don't have any insight into Apple development. I'm just here, just like you, with the same resources as you. So I'm going to be sharing those resources as we move along. So that's that. There's also a lot of great resources from the community, such as SwiftUI by example. A lot of people have been sharing a lot of great projects on Twitter. So those are great. Now, what we're going to be discussing specifically, and I think that really changes the way that we are designing and coding for iOS development, is some of the patterns, such as the sidebar here. You can see this is very new, and it makes a lot of sense because the iPad experience has never been super optimal, especially with the tab bar. Because if you think about it, a lot of apps with a tab bar have a ton of negative spacing on the left and the right side, and it takes a huge amount of efforts to make up for that space. And so I think the tab bar, and I think the sidebar is kind of the answer to that, right? Like if you look at it now, I don't have to fill this much extra space anymore, especially for screens like a search, like this one, or a table view, which is now kind of like a list. And otherwise, if you want to kind of fill the whole space, you're going to look at something like this. But let me just show you the difference. So if I go to, without a sidebar, you can see that I'm trying to fill the space, but it feels like instead of having a tab bar, which is on the far bottom, I could have a sidebar, which is on the left side. And I think it makes the navigation a lot better for the bigger screen. Now, in terms of the smaller screen, I think it still makes a lot of sense to have the tab bar. And the reason for that, it's because you want to be able to easily reach with your thumb, for one-handed usage, but also because of the smaller screen, we simply do not have the real estate for the sidebar. So because of that, having the sidebar, and for us developers and designers, including that sidebar makes a huge difference. And especially, and this is the big surprise, and this makes me so incredibly happy to be finally developing a Mac app in my lifetime. I've never even imagined before that I would be creating a Mac app because it's so alien to me. Like it's not like creating a website. It's a native experience. It works on desktop. It can use a lot of the new the technologies that are native, such as the camera or drag and drop, and all of the hard drive stuff. And so I think this is really exciting. But on top of that, you can leverage on the APIs that Apple has for the Mac, right? Like if you think about it, what makes iOS so powerful is because you can literally use anything that native experience can allow you to use. All the technologies, the camera, the location, all of these things. So having, being able to develop a Mac app leverages on that, And this is far beyond anything you can build on a website. I'm not saying that we're gonna stop building website. I'm just saying that this is going to open up a lot of opportunities for what you can do in the future. And right now, I'm still focusing on the layout, but if in the future I want to play videos, I want to have like picture-in-picture, which is a very new feature in all of the Apple platforms, I can do so quite easily using SwiftUI. And I think that's really exciting. And you can see the layout here, tutorials, is exactly the same layout as here, which is on iOS, and it's the same layout as here, which is on iPad. So we have a design language that is essentially being spread across all platforms, and that we can essentially reuse all the same components. So you can see that this card right here is the same as this card here. The only difference is the way that I'm using the space that is available to me, and also the font sizes. So if you're using dynamic type, you're gonna have, let's say this is going to be sub-headline, and this would be a caption or something like that, or you can use a title, or you can use a large title, and it's all going to be translated perfectly on different platforms, and Apple does all the work for you. So for example, here I have a title that is in a nav bar, and it is showing completely different than on the iPad, but the code is the same, right? Like I didn't have to change anything at all in terms of styling. So let me show you what the code looks like. So we are in the tutorials view, and this is the code. So I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna explain to you what is essentially happening. So first of all, I'm gonna explain this later. This is just like to make sure that I'm using and I'm detecting if it's on the iPad or if it's on the iPhone, and if it's on the Mac, right? Like, so I'm detecting if it's iOS and if it's a compact size, which is the iPhone. Otherwise, just show this. And the only difference is that I'm showing either the navigation view or not the navigation view. And this is specifically to my app, because sometimes because I'm using the tab bar in a different way, I have to show the navigation view or not. Otherwise, I'm gonna have a double navigation view. But I want you to focus right here. So here we have the new lazy grid, and this is essentially the same code. The only difference is I had to do a bit of conditioning for the Mac, and that's because of some small things such as the way that I'm setting the padding and stuff like that. Now, this code right here, so this code is enough. And I believe that if you're not talking about the quirks, about Mac development, all that stuff, I would be able to reuse 100% of this code to show exactly what I have here. And you can kind of like compare the two codes. Is essentially the same code. I'm just the only difference is that I cannot use the horizontal size class on the Mac, and because of that, I thought, well, let's just like create a condition for the whole thing, because I also have to change some padding sizes and frame sizes, such as the max width, that works better on the Mac. And also, I cannot use the navigation link, which I believe is a bug on the Mac. So that's the only thing. But apart from that, I think when we're going to be out of the beta, I'm going to be able to reuse 100% of this code for Mac development as well. Okay, but I just wanted to explain to you why I had to create this condition specifically for the Mac. But you can see that I'm reusing the same component, which is called a tutorial item, which is in a loop using my model tutorials that I'm looping, and I'm getting the component. I'm passing the data to the component, and I'm setting a max height, so that because my component itself is essentially adaptive. So the way I'm doing it and the way I'm organizing it is I'm putting some of the key elements in its own folder. And this is something that I've been struggling with a lot in the past, is how to organize my iOS project, right? And here, when I go to a lot of projects, what I'm noticing is that a lot of iOS developers, or a lot of developers in general, they tend to complicate the navigation of the project itself. So you're gonna have like 10 folders and 20 files and across different places, and it's really hard to navigate at some point. So one thing that I like to do, and this is coming from a designer who codes, who have done hundreds of projects in the past, not necessarily iOS project, but what I can say is that the way that I organize my files is the same way I will design a website. I don't want to have too many folders. It's like having too many tab items, right? If you have too many tab items, if you have too many menu items, then it feels awkward to navigate. So I like to limit the number of folders to about 3 or 4, and I like to keep the essential ones. And the way I'm organizing these files is that these are all the main views. So we're talking about the courses view, and then the course detail, the tutorials, the live streams, the download, and the search. So that's it. And I like to keep it simple. And I don't want to put the components here, because if you put the components on the main, the main views, and the reason why I'm putting this here is because I'm noticing that I have to always collapse and open. And because of that, I don't like to kind of move back and forth a lot. So having the main views here kind of makes sense to me. Now, I'm not saying this is like a final way of organizing thing, but this is kind of like my train of thoughts and where I'm going with this. And let's take a look at the folders. So we have the model, and this is a very common folder to have. The model is essentially where you're going to set up the data model, and then some of the sample data before even getting into API calls, right? Like at the very beginning process of your Mac or your app development, I think it's important to play with some sample data first, static data first, and to set the data model. This is super easy to understand. You're just creating like the name of the data model, and then you have the ID, and then you have a bunch of fields of different type, and that's it, right? I have one for course, I have one for tutorial, and I have a bunch of data that I can use so that I can fill my UI, and it feels like a real app, right? And this is really important because you want to anticipate all edge cases and use cases so that it's really easy to fix your design as a result of that, right? As designers, we often design in the blind because we design in Figma, and then suddenly 2 weeks later or a month later, then the iOS developers come in, and then they start playing with it, and then they realize the design is broken, and then they have to pass the communication back to the designer who doesn't have this information, and therefore there's a lot of back and forth, which means that an app like this can take 10 times longer than if you were to do it alone, being a designer who codes, right? So it's important as a designer to set up these data so that you can play with it, and that you have something in the final app like this that you can say, okay, what happens if I have like a lot more text, right? Like what happens if this is way bigger? So you would have like something like this. You can see here it's showing 4 lines of text, but here it's showing 6-7 lines of text, and this is how it looks like for this size, this is how it looks like for this size, and so on. And the same for the number of columns. So what happens if it's 1 column? What happens if it's 2 columns? What happens if you have a single line of title, or what happens if you have 2 lines of title? So all of these things needs to be anticipated by the designer, but also let's talk about the animation, right? Like the animation is another part. If the designer decides to prototype something, they spend a week creating the animation for this thing. Oh, again, it's not perfect, but you know, like a transition like this one, making your content to be scrollable, and eventually I'm gonna have dynamic content. Eventually, it's going to be rich text and all that stuff. But you know what happens, right? Like how do you develop as a consequence of the font sizes and the, you know, like the image size is growing to be bigger. This frame size is bigger. Again, we have this issue here. I don't know how to fix this one, but this is a very custom animation. That's why it has some of these quirks. And again, we're still in beta 1, which means that there's definitely a few things that needs to be improved. Now, so this is for the data model. And so I have the course section, I have the downloads, and that's all the data that I have for now. And then what are the items? So the items are anything that is a component that is repeatable. So the reason why I went with item instead of components is because components can be anything. Components can be a header, a title, or, you know, a button. And it, you know, sometimes you're gonna end up like with, you know, dozens of components, and it can become very hard to navigate. So what I thought was like, what if I created, you know, a folder just for item? And the reason why I went with item is because Apple went with this naming convention of grid item. So, well, not here, but if you go to a more custom grid layout, such as I believe is, or the navigation, it's called a grid item. So navigation item and toolbar item. So I kind of went with this naming convention. I thought it was making sense for something that repeats itself a lot. So for example, the course item, section item, tutorial item, these are all the things that I anticipate will be repeating itself a lot. And then the library is a new feature in iOS 14 and Xcode 12, which allows you to essentially reuse components. And you know, you're gonna see here, you have a library content provider, and you're gonna be able to reuse some of these components that you have created, and you can name them. So, you know, for example, I can reuse the card style for a modifier, and if it's a view, I can reuse the section content. The section content is just a bunch of text that I'm reusing, but I can also do that the same way for the items or for anything like the flip view, which is just one card that is being animated. So you can see here, I created this experimentation of a flip view that is flipping, and you know, it was kind of isolated because I didn't really know where I can use it for the moment. So I kind of put it in a component inside my library, so that now you can see I can just use this component anywhere else in my app. So let's come back to library content. Another thing that is cool about library content is that you can essentially, you know, Command Shift L to open. Command Shift L, is it? Whoa, I don't know. Okay, it's here. All right. I can search for section content, and because of the library, the library content, I'm able to add that to my list of insert menus, right? So usually you can search for label, or you can search for, you know, text view, and these are all the native controls, right? Like a button, a color picker, a date picker, and all that stuff. But what about the ones that you create, right? Like what about the card style, for example, or, you know, the section content? Well, here it is. And the only reason why it's here is because I created a library item for the library content provider, and then I created this. This is essentially the component itself, And using the library item, I'm able to set what category that it is using, and I can also set the title for that. If I don't like, whatever is being generated automatically for me, which is section content with the spacing. But obviously, they had to name it with the spacing. And the other thing that is cool is that I can reuse my modifiers and add that to my insert list. So now I can go back here and let's say, I go here and section content. So I'm going to insert it here. And there you go. And if I want the modifier, then I go to modifiers and I search for my card style. So again, coming from DesignCode Universal, and that's my project name, I'm able to insert the modifier just like this, right? And this is custom made, reusable modifiers that I added to the library content. So now I can just jump to definition and it's right here. So my modifier that is being reused is an extension of a view, and here I'm just passing the color, and I'm returning self for iOS because I had some, I just wanted to customize the corner radius, and so for macOS I wanted to have a less corner radius, because on iOS it makes more sense to have the corner radius to be bigger because of the rounded corners of the iPhone. So the corner radius has to be perfectly matching the corner radius of the iPhone as much as possible, which is why you have to set this condition where on the Mac, the corner radius have to be less pronounced, right? So versus the iPhone, you're going to see something that is much bigger in terms of corner radius. And it makes sense, right? Like this has to perfectly align with the corner radius of the iPhone, and it makes it more fun. It feels more tactile depending on the padding and all of this stuff. Then you can certainly add personality to your app. So this is my extension. Again, we simply have like a background color, and then we have a shadow based on the background color. Then I'm adding opacity, and then I'm setting the corner radius, and I'm changing the corner radius for the Mac because I want to have a less pronounced corner radius, and that's why I have this condition right here. So, all right. So this is for library, for the components, and also for my library content. And finally, navigation. Every app is going to have navigation, and this is really important because, for iOS, we're going to have the tab bar, and for iPad and macOS, we're going to have the sidebar. And again, it's not 100% ready, but just to give you some thought, some insight into this, it's very simple. We're going to have like a navigation view wrapped around a list. And this is a new pattern that I really, really enjoy seeing in iOS. And I saw that in the Footer app, as a sample code from Apple. They essentially, inside my component, right, I have multiple variables of some view. So you have the main one, which is being loaded. It's called body. And then you have the extra ones that you can use as sort of mini components inside this. So because of that, then you can reuse this name and set conditions easily instead of setting a condition around the whole thing. And so you can see that, my sidebar is being reused here. And all I need to do is to change whatever structure that I need to do, right? So for example, navigation title, if it's for iOS and iPad, and if it's for the Mac, then maybe I don't need the navigation title here. And maybe my toolbar is going to be different, and the size is going to be different. So by setting mini components inside a component, I'm able to reuse this easily without having to like creating a completely different view. And so I thought that this was kind of smart to do that, especially if you're developing for multiple platforms. You're going to end up having some conditions like this. And so for example, let me explain this condition here. This is the frame size for the sidebar, and this is to ensure that I have a minimum width of 100 and the ideal width of 150 and the max width of 200. So let's give it a try. So we're going to go to the Mac app, and this is the sidebar. Now, on the iPad, as we all know, the sidebar is not customizable. So if I go to the iPad here, let me just check. Yes, the iPad here, this is not customizable. I cannot just drag and resize this. But on the Mac, it's different, right? So we have to design for the platform. We can't just say, hey, you know, like, let's just use whatever. It's not as automatic as that yet. Now, granted, you know, SwiftUI for Mac is still new, so you know, Apple still has to iron out those issues. But the code that I just explained is, you can see it started with 150. I can go to minimum 100, and I can go to up to 200. And so that's kind of like why we have this frame size, min width, ideal width, and max width. So what else? So we have max height, and then we have the toolbar. Now the toolbar is a bit buggy on the Mac side, but the toolbar item here on the iPad side is fully working. So if I go to, you know, the iPad, you can see that this is my toolbar. It is using the iOS SF symbols. For those who are not aware of what it is, we're going to go to SF symbols 2. And it's essentially all the icons that is being provided by Apple. So you can go and search, and then you can download the app itself. You're going to click on here, and there's a beta for SF symbols 2, which now has multiple colors. And also they have more stuff. So let me open the app. I'm going to open the app, and this is the list of icons. So what is cool about this is that I can use this as part of the label. And you're going to see here the label is within my sidebar. I have, you know, the sidebar itself, and then I have a list for each item of the list. So I have courses, and it is using a label. A label is the text next to the icon. Instead of setting, you know, text, courses, and then I have to set like an H tag, and then I have to set like image, you know, system name, and then the name book.close, then the label is going to replace this automatically, right? So it makes it so much simpler. And on top of that, if you set a certain font size, it's going to adapt both, right? Like it's going to adapt both the label but also the SF symbols. And so you can see here in the Mac app, each label gives me one of these menu items. And it even gives me like the selected state, the accent color, which is another thing I want to discuss. So the accent color now can be customized in the assets catalog. Now every app is going to come with this accent color, and you can essentially do one for dark mode and light mode. And let me just go here to the sidebar, and I can select this for appearances, any and dark. So I can decide that my accent color is maybe lighter on on light mode and darker on dark mode. So I can go like with the opacity and the darkness. I can even use a hex value from Figma, for example, and just paste the code right here. It's going to allow me to change the color, right? So this is the accent color, and it's really important for iOS 14 because the accent color is being used pretty much everywhere. You're gonna see. So you can see here, my accent color is what is setting the color for the tab bar. So by changing the accent color, you can see that my selection state is not blue anymore. It's now purple. And also the selected state for my menu is purple. And they even said like the smooth corners already for me. I didn't have to do anything. Even the spacing between the menu items is automatic for me using the list, which is awesome because this is perfect for designing for the pointer. For those who are not familiar with the WWDC video called Designing for the Pointer, well, you want to make sure that when you have a mouse, so for example, eventually, iPad apps are going to be able to navigate. You're going to be able to navigate the app using a mouse. And so, there's going to be hover states. There's going to be, like a pointer, and it's going to adapt to the text. It's going to adapt to the buttons depending on the size of the button. And there's a bit of a glow effect and all these things. So when you use something like the sidebar menu or a list or a navigation view, then you have access to all of these things that are already all prepared for you. So for example, you can see that this menu here, the only code that is controlling that is here, right? Like it's not a lot of code, and it gives all of these functionalities for free, and it looks great. It looks new. It's gonna excite a lot of people, and so this is also a reason why I'm deciding to focus a lot on some of these native controls in iOS. Is in my new course, is because it makes a lot of sense now to use the tab bar, to use the sidebar. And I know in my previous course, I focused a lot on custom layouts because I wanted designers to kind of design something as custom and to prototype and to be able to anticipate any kind of layouts. But also it's great for developers because, they rarely use these custom layouts. So it's good to prepare them against, animations, custom layouts, padding and all that stuff. But I think, with iOS 14, it makes a lot of sense to kind of dial back and use the tab bar and use the sidebar. In fact, I kind of think it's essential to use the sidebar on iPad, right? Like, this is such a good user experience. It's kind of like, how many apps nowadays are using the hamburger menu? Not a lot of them. But most importantly, those who use the hamburger menu have to build a very custom control to accommodate for the hamburger menu. It's not wrong, but it's definitely not the most resource efficient way of developing. So instead, why can't you create an app like this one where we're using a tab bar and we're using a sidebar? And this is essentially just a few lines of code here. This is for the sidebar. And this is for the tab bar, right? Instead of, maybe 100 lines of code to create something very custom and that have to kind of accommodate against a navigation view eventually and all that stuff with a bunch of conditions, why not use something that Apple has created, which makes our lives so much easier and it makes a lot of sense. But on top of that, using this code makes it reusable for the Mac development as well. Right? So if you look here, if I was to use a custom control like a hamburger menu or something like that, I wouldn't be able to translate it for the Mac development because it's custom made. But by using the sidebar, I'm able to make it look almost identical using the best practices between Mac and iPad, right? So I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think designers need to know this. They need to know that we should all use the sidebar as much as possible, unless you're developing something completely custom like a game or a very custom UI, and you have a team of designers and developers who can accommodate so many kinds of use cases and build custom controls as a result of that. You work for Facebook and stuff like that. Sure, I understand. Maybe you don't want to use the sidebar. Maybe you want to have your custom made hamburger menu. But for the rest of us, especially developers, designers, small teams, I think it's good. I think it makes a lot of sense to just use this and focus on the content, how to present the content, how to animate the content, how to navigate the content. So for example, if you want to be playful, you can do so here, or you can do so with the flip view that I just shown, like, how you can do some of these things, such as, this animation here, instead of like trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of the navigation. And I think it makes a lot more sense. So that's why in this course, I'm going to focus a lot on the navigation. I'm going to focus a lot on using the sidebar, using the tab bar, and also using the navigation view. If you look at the iPad app, I'm able to navigate quickly to any of these sub-content, which would be a lot of effort to manage all of that stuff. But also it's the best practice, because, I know a lot of designers, they're like, hey, why don't I just use like a modal view, for example? Well, the modal view is not supposed to be used for like large content like this, for example. Let's say, maybe some designers might think, okay, maybe if I click here, it should show like a modal view, or maybe I click the SwiftUI handbook, it should show a modal view. But then what happens if you click inside the modal view and it goes to its own content inside the modal view? Well, it doesn't make sense. You shouldn't, because a modal is not supposed to have sub-content, right? Well, I guess it's not the best practice is what I mean. You can do it, but it's not the best practice. It's not the best user experience. So it makes a lot more sense to use the navigation view. And also you get these like transitions for free. For example, by default, I don't have a nav bar, but when I scroll, you can see that it transitions. But also the navigation is pretty neat. You go to the sub-content, you come back, and it animates the back button into the title. I think that's really neat. It also has the gesture. So for example, I don't know if it works on the iPad, but definitely on the iPhone, it has the gesture. So for example, I go here, and a lot of people enjoy this, this left gesture that you can swipe from the left, and it comes for free thanks to the navigation view. Now the navigation view is simply done using the sidebar. So again, I have this here, the body, which is the main load of the sidebar, and I'm wrapping everything against a navigation view. And then I have my mini component here that I'm referencing for both iOS and iPad against the Mac, with the frame size here, which is not needed at all for the iPad, but it is needed for the Mac, and also the toolbar, which currently doesn't work correctly on the Mac, which is why I had to remove it. And so the same for the buttons and all that stuff. Some of these things, will be improved, which means that later on I might not need to do this condition right here, but that's why I did it. And the main list, I'm setting the style of the sidebar, which is kind of cool. Now, for those new to iOS development, you can check the documentation. So for example, I can go option and select. So now I'm getting access to documentation. Another thing that I really enjoy in Xcode 12 is that the documentation is just 100 times better than before. And if I open right here, I'm gonna get this window, and now I have so much stuff that I can read about. And I can also check what are some of the list style that I can use. I click here, and these are the list style that I can use, such as right now I'm using the sidebar list style, but I can also use the plain or inset, group, so that I have different styles. Now, what I mean by those styles, well, let's take a look. I'm gonna go here to downloads. So this is a list, and this is a list. Let me just give you a proof of that. So I'm gonna go to the downloads view, and you can see it's right here. My first list is this one, right? And you can see it's wrapped against a list, and now I have a section with a title called video files. There you go. Right? So this is my list. There's nothing custom about this. And so all I need to do was to create a loop using the data from my data model, and I'm setting an H tag, or I could have just set a label. But in this case, I wanted to have something more custom in terms of the image. So that's why I set the H tag. And I set the V tag for the to text, right? And I have like different font sizes, you know, different spacing. So that's it. And at the end of the day, I can set the list style, which looks very different depending on the list style. So for example, if I go here, you can see that this looks very different from this list. And that's what the list style is about. So you can have like different ones. It looks different. And I'm going to explain, I'm going to go more into the details of that in the course. But, you know, that's just to show you the documentation, but also, you know, the sidebar style and the list style that can be adapted as much for the sidebar, for the main content. It can be adapted to, you know, different kinds of content. Even like a modal would look different in terms of like, you know, a list style. So that's that. Now let's take a look at SF symbols. So this is SF symbols, and I haven't really shown how to use the you know, the multicolor SF symbols. It's super simple. Let me just go to one of the views, let's say, or I can just create a new one. Command End. So I'm gonna just create test view. Okay, so I'm gonna bring my preview. And so this is my text. And another thing that you can do now, which is very new, is that the inspector is not useless anymore, right? I know it sounds funny, but it used to be useless to come here before. But now I can essentially just change the font size right from here, like, and you know, it's just going to apply the code for me automatically. And so this is fantastic for someone who's starting out. You know, as you get used to SwiftUI, honestly, it's just faster to go directly into the code. But someone who's starting out, this is fantastic. And you know, I can just change the color and whatever available options that I have. And you know, let's use blue. And I can insert more stuff. I can change the padding. There's also this neat little button that applies all the padding at once. Boom, and that's it. It gives padding all. I can also set custom padding, so for example 30. But most importantly, what I really enjoy is having a auto completion for the modifier. So for example, if I want to make this to have a background, but as you can see, there's no background option in my inspector right here. So obviously I'm gonna need to have a custom modifier. Apple can't, you know, think about adding all the modifiers to be part of this list. That would be insane. So instead of doing that, we're gonna search for, let's say, background. Boom, and that's it. It adds my background, and now it added this new item in my inspector. Really neat. And the same for the foreground color. Now that I have a background color, I cannot use the same color as before, or can I? Maybe this is not this is not a good example, but I can use, like, I don't know, corner radius. It's not here. Corner radius, boom. I can set it here, 10. There you go. And another thing that I really like is that you can double click on the text to edit. So for example, double click here on the text, please. I think it only works if I don't have a background, maybe. Well, it was working before. Let me just put it back. Okay. There you go. So for some reason, if I add a bunch of modifiers, it doesn't work anymore. But now I can just double click on the text. I can change it right away. So now my first SwiftUI app, right? That's it. I didn't have to go to the code and, okay, so let me change this text. No, I just need to double click on the text. My first app. That's it, right? This is really neat. And What else? So you can add as many modifiers as you want. There's so many modifiers. If you're a designer, this is kind of like a treasure trove of of things that you can try and see what is feasible and what is not feasible. As a designer, this is so good. This is so good because you know what technology allows you to do, what it can empower you to design. If you design in the blind and you don't know what the technology allows you to do, you end up creating a lot of wasted designs, right? Like maybe you're gonna come up with some weird font sizes or weird animations that would take a week to implement instead of like a single line of code. And so a designer can essentially design the correct way and cut development time by at least 10x. So the only way to do that is to understand better about the technology, the constraints inside the technologies. Like the designer who can do CSS can build a website much faster and much more efficiently and can collaborate better with developers. So that's that. Now, let's talk about SF symbol. So I can insert, boom, go to my insert. I'm going to go to image, which is not a modifier. So I have a bunch of tabs. I have the main views, so the main controls. I have the modifiers. I have the code snippets. I have the images. This is from your assets catalog. And I also have my colors. So my colors, such as the ones that I have set up in my assets catalog. And for those who don't know what is the assets catalog, I'm gonna go right here, and this is where you're gonna set up the app icon. I have like for the iPhone, for the iPad, and for Mac. Okay. And I have the colors. So colors is really important, and it's good to set up these colors, especially if you have a custom background. So in this case, for example, I have a slightly off-white background, and I want to be able to use this background and to make it adapt for dark mode as well, so that my app is going to work on dark mode. And let me just, I haven't tested, so it's not guaranteed to work, but let me test it. So I have this run, okay? And essentially there's this option here that allows you to override some of the interface settings, and I can go to light and dark mode. And so if I click on dark mode and I come back to the app, boom, it's in dark mode. And voila, it works perfectly, right? Look at that. Well, I didn't see, I set a background white, which is why this is not working. This is like super easy to fix, but you can see the rest works perfectly. Dark mode. And the reason why it works perfectly for dark mode is because I did not set up custom colors, like hard-coded colors. Okay? And every page works. And let me just fix this one. Let me just fix this one right here, right now. So this is my courses view. And my courses view has this new thing. I'm going to go into it, but it's called Match Geometry Effect, which allows me to create this beautiful animation transition like the Apple Store, like the App Store Today tab. But there's one part where I set up a color white, so right here. And this is wrong. I shouldn't do this. You should not custom code the colors as much as possible. And what you're going to notice is that I'm not using any custom code unless it's a custom background. So for example, this card here, I know will always be purple, and therefore the text will always be white, regardless if it's dark mode or not. Okay? And that's fine. But for the rest, such as the text here, and let's say the background for my full view card, then I should not create like a custom background, because I have to think, well, it's possible that my text is going to become white in dark mode, because the text itself does not have a custom color, right? And therefore, instead, I should do color, And I believe I can just go to insert and bring the color itself. So background 2, let's say. Boom. And just like that, I have fixed my dark mode. My app is fully working in dark mode. Let me just build it and show it to you. So I'm gonna go to the app. Let's set up the dark mode and go back to simulator. Voila. Boom. Fully working in dark mode. And that's because I changed my manually quoted background color. So to reiterate, try to not use custom colors as much as possible if the background, unless the background is a custom color and it's always that color regardless of if it's dark mode or not, in which case you can also decide that this purple color has a dark mode color, because some colors are a little bit too bright for dark mode. Some colors. I noticed that Apple actually has, you know, a dark mode colors. So for example, if I go to the iOS UI kit for the colors, and I think it's here, maybe, yes, there you go. So if you go to the iOS design guidelines, they do have a dark mode for each color, which is a slight tone darker than the normal mode. So for example, you can see that this blue right here is a little bit darker for dark mode. If I'm not mistaken, the top one is the normal, or this one is the normal. I'm not sure. I'm gonna verify that later, but you can see that one is dark mode and one is not dark mode. Interesting. So the lighter version is actually the dark mode version, if I understand their UI design correctly. So that means that they're making the color slightly lighter in dark mode. Maybe it's because the branding, it needs to pop more. I don't know. Maybe it's because the tab bar, you know, because it's an accent color for most apps, such as messages, for example, is an accent color, and it has to be, you know, more visible, perhaps. I would love to understand the reasoning behind that, but yes, there is a dark mode color for each of them. All right, so let's talk about match geometry effect. This is super exciting. It can be very easy, but it can also be very complex. But the complexity is not because of the match geometry effect, not at all. It's just the nature of the layout, right? Like if you look at the layout here, I have to think about all of these edge cases. So for example, this is a grid layout. This is by no means simple. Try to do this on the web, it would be extremely hard, especially with content that is scrollable, with interactions like this. Okay, this is by no means a simple interaction, but I did want to show you that it's easily feasible using match geometry effect. And I actually go step by step. I can't show you right here because this is kind of the final code, but when you're going to be taking my code, my course, I'm going to show you step by step from the tiniest customizations into the final app, which is what we see in front of us. So, but right now what I can show you is only the final results, so it looks a little bit complicated. Now, I'm gonna do my best to explain what's going on. Okay, so here I'm using a layout grid, okay? And this is what allows me to have 2 elements per row. And this was not feasible for iOS 13. Now, let me just show you. You can see here I have 4, but on iOS, on the iPhone, I have 2. And I had to use the lazy V grid. So I'm setting the columns, and I'm setting the spacing between the columns and between also the rows, and then I'm adding a padding to surround everything. Okay? So after that, I'm setting a for each loop. And here I'm getting the index because I have to change the show condition. And I apologize for those who are not like super, you know, who hasn't done my course in the past. They would probably have a hard time understanding this part. But like I said, my course is going to make sure that you're going to go step by step. It's going to be much easier to understand. But so I have a VStack. And the VStack contains the course item. So the course item is each of these cards. Okay. If you only look at the course item, it's only the card itself. It does not have the background with the content and etc. In fact, let me just show you what the course item look like. Actually, we use the course item somewhere else for live streams, for example. So this is the course item as well. So you can see here course item, and here the code is much simpler. It's just for each course item. That's it. Back to my courses view, and this is where I'm setting up my custom transition. I have my course item, which is wrapped inside a VStack, and the VStack has a white background. Remember the white background, and that's why I put it right here. There is the normal mode, which is the non-expanded mode of my card. And then there's the full screen mode, which is when it is fully expanded to this content right here. Okay? And let me show you. The code is almost identical, almost, except for a few things. So again, the full screen mode is also doing a full for each, and that is because we have many items. Right? Like, it's simple to have a single card that expands to full screen. That's super simple. When it becomes complex is when you have to deal with data. When you have to do a for each loop, and when you have to have its own scroll view for each of the item, and when you have to set up a bunch of, so for example, I can set up like a close button right here that sits on the top right, and you know, I have a background blur that's happening, so you can see, you know, there's a bit of background blur in the back. So those are the key differences between the normal card and the full screen card. Okay, so on the normal card, I have a scroll view. On the full screen card, I simply go into the for each loop one by one. And everything is wrapped inside a Z-stack. Okay, the Z-stack makes sure that, you know, I have two layers. So one is the layers of cards, and the second is the full screen mode. And by default, the full screen mode is hidden. Okay, and so I hope I'm making sense here. I hope you guys can follow. Please let me know if it's too complicated. I should just skip this part. I'm trying to explain, like, you know, many layers of code that have come into this. So cards, full screen mode card. One is hidden, one is not hidden. When I click on the card, it's gonna go into the full screen. This is going to be at the bottom layer, and this is going to unhide itself. It's gonna show up, and it's going to show the full screen mode, right? So that's exactly what's happening. I have a scroll view that wraps against everything, and I have my title. I have my lazy grid, which is not part of this full screen mode. The lazy grid is not here. I don't need the lazy grid for the full screen mode. And then this is where we're starting to share the commonality between the two modes. So I need a full screen mode for each card because each content is different. Okay? Each content is different. And also for performance issues, I cannot show every single full screen mode. Please do not spam. Big Sure, please. I cannot, show every single view hidden. That wouldn't make sense performance-wise. So I had to kind of show one by one only when I need it. So VStack, this is kind of like my hidden full view. And I had a question about the clip shape. So clip shape is continuous, and it's kind of wrapped. It's kind of like a mask. So that's what allows me to have this smooth rounded corners. And the magic is right here. The magic is just this. Match geometry effect. So what is the match geometry effect? It allows you to tag two separate views. So I have the card, which is a separate view, from the full screen mode card, which is another view. And it allows me to tag the two of them so that they can transition from one to another automatically. Okay, I don't have to set up animation behaviors and if statements inside like the ternary operators inside each of these cards. You're noticing that I didn't do any like show. Oops. Like I didn't do any show question mark else and then show this. No, I didn't do any of that. Right? Like I didn't do any of that in terms of like the background color or the sizes or except maybe for the opacity, because I wanted, this is the extra content. This is not shared. But here, the course item is unchanged. And it does all the animation for me. So you can see between the two, there's a match geometry effect that is taking the item ID. And then we have a namespace. So the namespace is kind of like, I guess it's an animation collection of sorts, and it's a space in which multiple views coexist together and can transition between each other. And it's kind of like Keynote, magic move, or if you go to Figma, for example, if you go to the animations, then you can go here. And you can see that we have one state and then we have another state, and then it does the magic move for you. Well, the match geometry is like saying, okay, well, I have two different views, because remember that this is kind of like expecting you to have the same views. But with the match geometry, you can have two different views that exist separately with different data. And you can share the elements that are the same. So for example, I can say, well, in the two views, I have the same title, I have the same subtitle, I have the image, and I have the background, right? So I'm essentially tagging the container of that, and I'm making it match the full screen mode using the ID and the namespace. Now, I could have done this as a separate component elsewhere as a new file. So I could have created like full screen view and then, having the normal view here. The reason why I didn't do that, and I created like a mini component, full content and normal content, is because right now we cannot share the namespace yet. At least from my understanding, I didn't find a solution to create a component and pass the namespace to the component. So as a result, we need to have the namespace inside the same component. And that's why we have my code to be set up this way. But otherwise, I would have just like created a different component for, let's say, this scroll view right here. And it would have simplified my code and easier to read. I don't like files that are over 100 lines of code. And this hurts me a little bit, but because of these quirks, because of this lack of option, I had to do that. And yeah, the namespace is just a name. So it's just here, namespace var namespace. That's it. You know, it's just, this is a custom name, and it's just to identify the space in which those animations can happen. And I'm guessing you can have multiple namespace across multiple views eventually. And so it's gonna have different names eventually. But yeah, that's it. You know, like the only thing that I set up was this match geometry effect using the ID per item, because you have to think that every single card here has to have its own ID and have to transition to its own full view, which is why it's important to be unique. Otherwise, if I click here, it's just going to full view every single view at the same time, and that's not what we want. And so that's the complexity of the layout and not the complexity of match geometry effect. And again, I'm going to simplify explaining this by going step by step in my course, but this is the best I can do with the final result that you're seeing right now. So yes, I mean, there are also a few things for developers out there, they might appreciate this. So for example, when you click here, the space is on the same layer, so you have to customize the Z index to make sure that it's always on top, but it's only on top if it's the one being active. And also I've been trying to find the solution on how to get both the loop item and you know, the item plus the index, but I couldn't make it work. For example, I can't get like item and index as well. I can only get the index. And the reason why I'm using the index is also because if I only use the items, I cannot change the state of the specific array you know, show inside the item. And so for example here, for each item inside the array, I'm toggling the show for each item, which is what allows me to toggle on and off for specific cards. And so I would love to hear what you have as a solution. And if I don't do it using the index way, it just tells me that it's immutable, and I cannot change the toggle from true to false. And so that's why I had to go this route. We're using the indices, getting the index value, and for each item, I have to sort of like do it this way, which obviously I prefer to do item.id. It's just much easier to read. But because I'm using the index value, I'm getting the array itself, and using that index value, I'm just targeting, you know, whatever item inside that array that I'm using. So yeah, so I'm definitely looking for a simpler way to do this. I would definitely challenge any developer who can find a solution here. But otherwise, this technique of having an array and using the index, that's already part of my first course of SwiftUI, if you want to take it. By the way, the first course of SwiftUI that I have out there is not going to be, you know, it's not the same course as this one. So this course is focused on iOS 14 and all the new techniques that are not available on iOS 13. The other thing is that the current course, which has 60 sections, is good for iOS 13. So if you want your app to support iOS 13, you should take my current course. Okay, and this is super important. It's not going to overlap. The new course that I'm building right now, which is what I'm showing, is focused on iOS 14. So it's only going to work on iOS 14. And secondly, it's kind of like a part 4, because I'm going to show you new techniques that I'm not going to repeat, you know, in the previous course. So for example, I'm not going to go over color literals. I'm not going to go over you know, static data and some of the things that I've taught Like I'm not gonna go over how I created those card animations, or you know, like a tab bar or a Z stack. I'm not gonna go over the things that I already taught. This is kind of like a part 4. And for anyone who wants to learn SwiftUI, I suggest that you take my first course first, and it goes extremely deep. It's not a beta. You can use it using Xcode 11. You don't have to upgrade to Big Sur. And so this is good. And it's friendly, you know, it's teaches you all the way. This course is more like a part 4. Now, I'm not saying that if you haven't taken the first course, you're not going to be able to take this course. At the end of the day, I'm still going to start from the beginning, starting a new project, and you're going to be able to take this course as well. It's just that there are a lot of concepts that I will not go over again in this course that I already taught in the first course. And so I highly suggest that you take the first course first. So this is the geometry effect. And visual effect blur. This is kind of interesting. And I've been using the one by Apple. So what are you noticing here in this project is that we have a folder for iOS and a folder for Mac. And let's take a look at the one provided by Apple, actually. Like they do provide files for you know, through the app, for example. So as I mentioned before, you know, if you want to learn SwiftUI, there are a few WWDC videos that I recommend. One is Introduction to SwiftUI. You know, there's a lot, like a few more videos of, for example, grid stacks and all that stuff. I'm going to link them in the video. And the other way that I love to learn is through the source code that Apple provides. So let me take a look. All right, let's open this. All right, it's right here. All right, so let's take a look at what Apple has. So in this project, you're gonna be, they have created a widget, which I actually should show you as well. And they have created an app clip, which they do have a WWDC for them respectively, right? You can learn how to make an app clip. You can learn how to create a widget in their WWDC videos. So that is covered. I'm still gonna put it in my course because I teach it differently, and I think it can be valuable to do it in a way that is progressive rather than just making you jump into deep waters at first try. But I just wanted to point out that Apple has those resources for you. And so they have the source code, and I always love to model my files and my practices against what Apple has put out there. So for example, this is where I decided to have a model folder or a navigation folder. I thought it was a good idea, but I also found that they have too many folders, so definitely didn't take everything. They have a widget folder. I'm not sure why, because the widget folder is, for me, is right here. And I think they might have a different folder for each platform, perhaps. So they have like iOS widgets and macOS widgets as well. But they have a widgets folder here. They have styles, which is interesting. This also I might do to have like a folder just for style, which is the modifiers. And right now I'm putting those styles inside library because kind of putting everything together. What else? So they have a folder for components, and this is interesting that they name it components, because components is kind of like a name that not Apple have come up with, right? Like Figma used the term components, but also React reused the term components. But you know, Swift used the term subviews, and I find it interesting that they decided to name it components. Instead I went with items for things that are repeatable. they have a bunch of things that are really interesting to explore. So for example, I went with I wanted to see how they did the flip view, so the thing that turns around, but I ended up doing it myself from scratch. I did not use their technique at all for the flip view. The flip view is this view right here that does this, but they have something like that on the Fruit app. They also have the navigation, so they have the sidebar, and this is where I learned how to do the if OS statement, Mac OS else. I also learned from their code how to do the mini component. So you have the body, and then you have other things like sidebar. Really a good place to learn. I personally learn a lot from their code. This is where I learn all of these techniques myself, and it's good practices. If Apple does it, that means that that's probably the correct way to do it, right? Like I wouldn't anticipate Apple to do it incorrectly. I disagree. Someone's saying that SwiftUI is not ready for production. I disagree with that. Of course, it depends on what company you're working for, especially if you want to develop for iOS 13 using the iOS 13 techniques, you can cover, I think, more than 90% of the user base, and it's very, very stable. SwiftUI for iOS 13 in Xcode 11 hasn't changed for the past 8 months, and it doesn't have everything like SwiftUI 2 has, but you can build a fairly simple app. I'm not saying you're going to build the same complexity as you can with UIKit, but you can do like a fairly simple app using SwiftUI. Now, if you're willing to support iOS 14, as Apple says, you can essentially build for all platforms, and it's really, really good, especially when we're going to go out of beta in September. So when we have all of these quirks out of the way, such as Mac development, just imagine how powerful this would be, right? Just imagine being able to build with so little amount of code. As you can see from here, like most of these views have less than 100 lines of code. And some of these lines are just for the previews, and some of these lines are just for the conditions. And they're like really, really simple conditions. They're not like super complex conditions that takes care of so many edge cases. It's just saying, hey, are you on iOS or are you on the iPad? If not, show it this way without the navigation view. That's it. That's all there is. And, you can build for all 3 platforms using this code. I think this is mind-blowing to me. And if I wanted to, I can support the tvOS, and I can support for the Apple Watch as well. And so just imagine the opportunities. And by the way, the reason why we're seeing this is because we have a horizontal size class does not work as a condition yet for the preview for some reason. They haven't fixed that yet. So Apple, if you're listening, please make horizontal size class work on the preview as well. But it works on the device. All right, so let's take a look. So what else? What else did I learn from this project? I learned how to create the widget from their WWDC video. The app clip I haven't learned yet because it's not something that I immediately will probably use. But in terms of the widget, I decided to do it, and it was just a few simple steps, and that's it. This is the widget. Oh, I changed the data, so that's why we're seeing far more data, but I was limiting to a number of data. I should have limited to like 3 or 4. And so this is my app clip, and I can preview this on the phone, and this is what it looks like. I can preview this against a small. I haven't adapted yet, but I can decide to change to the small widget. I can change to the medium widget, and I can change to the large widget. Oops. There we go. And the widgets is super simple. It's just SwiftUI. VStack, the title. But you don't see the title because I have a lot of stuff here. And then for each statement, for each of the H stack. And that's it. So to create a widget, I'm going to try to do it. I think you have to go to New, and you have to click on Target. And here, inside the target, you have something called a Widget Extension. So I wonder, I think I just went to iOS. Okay. So I have the Widget Extension. The widget is slightly different for Mac OS, I believe, but it doesn't seem that they have like a multi-platform widget, but definitely iOS works. So once you do this, it's going to create your folder, which is right here, and you're gonna have to name it. You're gonna have to set a bunch of things, and once it's done, it's going to create some placeholder here. It's gonna allow you to set like a timeline, so when your data is supposed to be refreshed, and soon they're gonna have this thing called a placeholder, which I look forward to play with, because you can turn any of these stacks and content into simple lines automatically for you. And I hope they're gonna open this API for the entire app, because how many times do I see apps where when you click and the data is making, like the app is making an API call, it takes maybe a second to load the data. Well, in between, it's going to show a placeholder bunch of lines that animates. You know, Facebook does that, Instagram does that, and a bunch of other apps does that. And it's just a really good and very nice thing to do. Instead of showing a loading animation in the middle of the screen, it does that. So there's going to be a simple modifier that does this. .placeholder, I think, placeholder written like this, and set to true. I think it is placeholder. So there's a simple modifier. It's not available yet, but it will be. And when you do this on any H stack or any element, it's going to create those lines for you. And what I mean by those lines, let me just show you, is something like this, right? It's gonna create those lines and shapes without any content, and that's fantastic. And it's going to do automatically based on your content. So for example, here it's going to create a simple rectangle with rounded corners up until here. The same for this line. The logo is going to be without the image. It's just going to be a simple color. And it's also going to take your color. Maybe it's going to keep that green and blue and red. And so that's fantastic. But that's going to be in a future version of the beta. So we're almost at 1 hour 30. I'm going to take a bunch of questions. Let me just read some of the comments, making sure that I can answer some questions here. All right. Do you need to be checking on every component if iOS? No, you don't have to. The only reason you need to do the condition is when, let's say some code is not supported. So for example, the visual effect view is written differently on Mac OS. Okay, so let me show you. It's in the courses view. So I created a blur view, which is what Apple actually did as well. And so on this blur view, on Mac OS, it's just written this way. It does not have a system material. On iOS, it's written this way. Now, if iOS decides to write it this way as well, and it works, then yes, you don't need to create this condition. This condition is only needed if such and such code is not supported on both platforms. The same way for, let's say, the environment object. So horizontal size class, for those who don't know what it is simply being able to detect classes of device depending on the width available to you. So for example, an iPhone at landscape mode is a different size class than an iPhone at portrait mode. And it's more like an iPad resolution. So the horizontal size class allows you to detect that and apply, let's say, the number of columns as needed. So that's why, and this code is only available on iOS. And yeah, you know, like there's not a lot of things, to be honest. And honestly, I think that some of these code will probably end up being supported on Mac as well. And so the rest is just like, for example, the sidebar. I'm checking, you know, I'm putting like a frame on that sidebar. And the navigation title is not fully working on the Macs, which is why I decided to omit this. But otherwise, it works. What else? Okay, let me go to the next question. So yes, earlier you saw some syntax highlighting, and that's probably because, you know, sometimes you load the file and sometimes it does not load the highlighting everywhere, but most of the time it works. And you know, it's one of those things that it's more like an Xcode issue, and it's just sometimes that it happens. And to fix that, you can just restart Xcode, you can rebuild Xcode, and it should work back again. It's been a non-issue for me, to be honest. This stream will be available later. So we are working to make this available on the website so that we can stream it at 4K. Right now on YouTube, we can only stream it for 1080p. And also for our subscribers, we're gonna make it available for you in 4K, first of all. Second of all, we're gonna make it available with, you know, kind of like a transcript, if you will. And third of all, we're gonna share the source files for our subscribers. On YouTube, it's free to watch, and you can watch, just follow along. And you know, we do this because, you know, we need to make sure that this is something I can keep doing. Otherwise, you know, it's hard for me to decide to do just live stream. You know, I wouldn't be able to do this full time. Would have to find a job or something like that. So to be able to offer this, some of the premium contents and the source files, and you know, make the, you know, creating courses along the way, you know, allows us to keep going and create more content for you. Now, I want to explain the difference between the courses, the tutorials, and the live stream. And we decided to have these three types of content on Design Plus Code. Why? Because the courses is more like you go to a restaurant and you have like a five items meal, right? You know, there's the appetizer. It's really like step by step, following you along the way. It holds your hand. It's like buying an album, like a music album, and you're listening to a song one by one from the first one. And it makes sense. Like that's how the artist intended. And it's making sure that you can learn step by step. So that's what the course is about. And it's all like, it's more scripted than a live stream, and every step is explained. The tutorial is more like a song, you know, like you can just listen to one song and go on and learn about another one separately in your order of your choosing. It's good for someone who already knows SwiftUI, and that's what the tutorials are for. It's great for searching. It's great for, you know, without context, you can just come in and learn specific techniques. So for example, you just want to learn how to create an app clip, then you go to tutorial, search for app clip, you go straight to the content. And that's what the tutorials are for. The live stream, on the other hand, is a long form format in which I'm interacting with you. It's kind of like going to a concert. It's like an experience that is live. And I think that's great because we can explore, we can experiment, I can take questions, and it's easier to create as a format versus a course. I have to be very prepared. I have to kind of know my material beforehand. Here, I can just like explain what I have done, and it's definitely easier to digest for a lot of people who maybe, are already aware of a lot of things. They want to know about new things that are going on. So that's why we have these 3 types of content, and why each of these types are, I believe, valuable to our to our readers, to our students. So I really look forward to put them into the app, both on the Mac, on the iOS, on the iPad. I'm also hoping to make it available on Apple TV. I'm not sure if it makes sense for the Apple Watch, but definitely maybe for notifications and also as part of the course would be a great thing to learn. But otherwise, like, I'm really, really excited. We also have a website coming, and some of you have been asking where we have the course. So it's on DesignCode.io, and we have a lot of courses such as UI design for developers, the current SwiftUI course for iOS 13, which has 60 sections. It's really, really comprehensive, and you should definitely take this before the new course, which should be coming in about 10 days. And I already have prepared more than half of the course, and I will probably extend it to part 2 and part 3, depending on how excited people are going to be about this course. But yeah, this is all coming, and I'm really excited to be not just developing the actual app. This is a real app. This is not like a fake app. And we're going to be like we're going to be facing real problems. We're not going to be facing just like a fake app or a fake prototype. Like, this is a real app. It's going to be in the App Store very soon. And before getting into the data part, I'm gonna I'm gonna create a course first. And again, all the source files are going to be shared. Let me take more questions. By the way, thank you for the likes, everyone. And some people disliked it. I'm not sure why. Definitely when I discuss about SwiftUI being ready or not. So we definitely have Flutter fans in the audience. Okay, so for macOS development, which website or course do you recommend? Now, this is a good question. There are 2 types of Mac development. The first one is using, I believe, AppKit. Again, I'm just speaking from what I know. I might be very ignorant about this. AppKit and Catalyst. So this is, I think, with or without SwiftUI, I'm not sure. And it's using all the sort of like old or the legacy APIs that are already available. You can create full-fledged Mac apps with that. And for those resources, I'm not too sure, but definitely a good start would be the WWDC videos from past years. And what I do recommend for beginners is to go straight into SwiftUI. Especially this year, they have made available everything that is almost everything that is available on iOS is available for macOS as well. And so this is really exciting. And if you want to learn macOS development now, I would go straight into SwiftUI. I would watch the videos at WWDC specifically about macOS development, and or better way, just take my course or take a course that creates universal apps like the one that I'm creating right now. And the reason why is because you can transfer the knowledge between those platforms. So if one day you feel like, hey, I want to create a Mac app, well, you can use the same techniques, the same components that you have created for SwiftUI. And, for iOS, for iPadOS, and, it's all very contextual. And that's great, right? It's like someone who's building a React Native app and already knows React. That's great because you can use the same components, you can use the same techniques, and that's fantastic. So you're going to be able to do the same for SwiftUI. So is macOS created with the latest SwiftUI only can be run on macOS Big Sur? Yes, I believe so. I believe that only the Mac OS Big Sur can run you know, Xcode 12 SwiftUI for Mac, as far as I know. Someone might be able to correct me. Do you know if it's the same for iOS 13? New SwiftUI things can target iOS 13 or iOS 14 only? Yes, absolutely. So for example, and I actually should talk about grid. I kind of skipped the grid. I should talk about the grid. Grid has different ways to change the source of your content. So for example, here, I can set the columns. So remember before we have the lazy grid, and it's just needing the columns variable as well as the spacing. Now you can set it multiple ways. One, you can set, okay, an array of grid item. So each grid item will have its own spacing. You can set, you know, flexible and all that stuff, max width, min width, and all that stuff. But otherwise, if your item itself is customizable and resizable and flexible, then it's going to make your experience of creating grids so much faster. So if you go, for example, for each of the course item, you can see that it's taking the full width. And one key factor about this is you should use spacer as much as possible. I know for a while I've been using a lot of frame infinity, max width infinity, and what I realize is that it's not as good as it should be, especially with match geometry effect and also with some of the grids layout that I've been experimenting with. So I'm kind of back to using spacer, and I also noticed that Apple use spacer a lot. So I'll probably use spacer more often nowadays instead of using frame max width. And yeah, you know, like you can see, each of my items are taking the full space available all the time. And because I'm using always the full space available, then when I come back to my grid, such as this one, let me just open to iPad so that it's easier to show you. So this is my, all right. So you can see here I have columns, and this, I'm not sure what this, oh, it's probably something hidden. It's bad. I'm gonna fix that later. So this is my grid, and this is for iOS, and I can also write it differently, which I really enjoy. This is kind of like CSS grid for me, or Flexbox. It allows you to repeat the same grid over and over, and all I need to do is to change the count. The count is the number of items per row, right? So if I set it to 5, boom, I have 5 items. If I set it to 6, to 4, to 3, and it automatically adjusts for me the layout. And this is super useful. I didn't have to kind of manually set the fixed width, fixed height of each of the elements. I'm just using a spacer to push as much as possible. And on top of that, I'm using a max height, which is really interesting, right? Like, I can set also the max width to 240. And now, each of my item, even though they can go to max width, like to a maximum width, I'm just setting it manually per items if needed, right? Depending on the number of columns and so on. So this is fantastic. I really, really enjoy using this way of setting the grid. And by the way, the reason why I did it here is because when you set it in the variables here, it does not refresh automatically my preview. So by having it here, I can just change the number and it just automatically refresh, because whatever code change that you do here inside the content or the body, you know, it will automatically refresh the content on the right side in the preview. But whatever you change here in the variables, you have to resume all the time, which is really annoying in my opinion. So I hope Apple is going to do something about this. So yeah, that's lazy grid. Super easy to do. Array repeating. You can set a flexible, or you can set a fix, and you can set also, I think, the alignment. So there's a lot of things you can do with grid. The only thing it cannot do, unlike CSS, is to wrap the content. So I know in CSS what you can do is like, if you can decide like each item will have a fixed width, and if it doesn't fit within that container, it's going to go to the next line. So that's called wrapping. And right now I haven't found a way using lazy grid, but otherwise I found that having each component to be flexible in terms of size, using a maximum size combined with a max height and max width, it makes for a super easy layout, which is what allows me to create these 3 columns, 2 columns. So you can see, you know, back to my app, right? So 2 columns, 4 columns, and all I needed to do was to change the count variable. That's it. Really, really simple development. This is not a grid actually. But yeah, if you do it correctly using the best practices, all your apps should be, you know, applied to dark mode automatically. It should work for all 3 platforms automatically. And that's the dream, right? Like, if you can just develop once and understand the platform, right? Like, this is not like React Native where you have a single code base and it's supposed to kind of look the same way. It doesn't really adapt to the platform necessarily. What I enjoy about SwiftUI is that it does adapt to the platform, right? Like a tab bar or sidebar looks very different from the Mac. You know, like you can see the size of the fonts are different. The icons are different size. The navigation view titles are different. And the behaviors, even the modal. So if I click here, this is a modal on the Mac, but a modal on here is different. Like it does this animation. I haven't implemented it yet, but a modal would just like do the modal behavior on iOS. And I love the idea that it just adapts to the platform with the same code. All right, let me take more questions. There's someone working on backporting SwiftUI 2 to work with iOS 13. I think that would be amazing. Absolutely. But yeah, you know, last year people complained a lot that, you know, SwiftUI could only support the new iOS 13 at the time. And, you know, there was like a device support of like maybe 60% at the time. But nowadays we have about 90 to 95%. So this is fantastic, which means that you can essentially cover most of the market by supporting iOS 13. But the problem is we have the same problem, is that this year, if you want to use like layout grid, or if you want to use like Mac development this way, you want to use the new APIs for app clip, for widgets, then you have to support iOS 14, unfortunately. Which kind of makes sense, right? Like widgets don't work on iOS 13 anyways. So I'm going to take more questions. All right. Do you have an ARM Mark Mini? No, I don't have it yet. I think that's it. Again, thank you so much for coming to my live stream. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it and you want to see more of these live streams, please give me a thumbs up. This is what allows me to say, hey, maybe people find it useful, so I'm going to create more of these live streams. Again, if you want to watch it in 4K, you want to get access to the source files, please come to DesignCode.io. And the new course, which is going to go step by step, I'm going to explain all of these concepts from scratch. And it's going to be coming out in about a week and a half. So please look forward to that. And again, thank you so much for coming to my live stream. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.